Everybody loves baby goats, but what do you do when the mothers reject them? G'day there, I'm Dana from Fantail Valley Homestead. Our goat River, we have been waiting for her for about the last 3 or 4 weeks to give birth. She has been absolutely massive, and she's one of those goats that she doesn't really give much sign that she's about to have her babies before she actually has them. I'm going to let my 12-year-old who played midwife tell you what she did.
What happened this morning?
I woke up at 2-ish and Dozer wanted out, so I let him out. And when I opened the door to let them in, I heard a baby goat coming from the shed. And they went down there, and there were twins.
So did you have to come up and get a towel?
Yeah. And I spent the next hour, maybe half an hour, drying them.
2 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
So I'm pretty impressed with what Talia managed to do. Not only was it 2 o'clock in the morning, but she did all the right things and she didn't even have to come and get me. So unfortunately, River, her history is last year she had a baby goat who got stuck because she didn't show any signs that she was going into labour, and we didn't find her until 6 o'clock in the morning. And her baby goat got stuck and ended up with a very swollen tongue. So not only did she have a very traumatic birth, but she also had a baby that wasn't able to feed. So I ended up tube feeding him, and unfortunately once his tongue swelling all went down, he refused to latch onto a bottle, and the tube feeding, he must have aspirated at some point and he developed a chest infection. Unfortunately, he passed away. But I do have a video that I did on how to tube feed a goat. If I look a little spacey in it, I was currently coming down with a migraine and I couldn't see what was in front of me at the time. So I will link that at the top for you. There are some reasons that may make a goat not bond with her babies immediately. This can be known as a rejection or just an inability to recognize them as her own. So I'm going to go through the 10 reasons that might be causing your goat to not recognize her babies and what you can do about those things at the end. So first-time mothers, they're known as first freshers in the goat world, and it is much more common for them to reject or not recognize their babies as their own. Usually once a goat has had more than one set of babies, usually by then she'll work out how this whole thing works. But it can be quite a shock to the system the first time they have them. If your mother goat had a traumatic or difficult birth, now trauma doesn't necessarily refer to an emotional experience. In this particular circumstance, I'm talking about a medically traumatic, so damaging or difficult birth. If she has had a traumatic birth this time round, the hormones that she's experiencing when she's having that birth are quite different to a natural, easily progressive birth. And so it means she misses out on a lot of that oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. The same goes for if she has had a traumatic birth in the past, especially if it's her first birth, and then the second birth it may go really smoothly, but if the first one was traumatic, it can affect the bonding process of the second time. If the traumatic one was her first and she didn't end up bonding and raising that first baby, the second time round she's basically essentially a first time mum again, and you're going to have to help her achieve that bonding. Say hi. Gonna say hi? Some genetic lines just have bad mothering instincts. And so unfortunately a lot of our dairy goats in large herds are not bred for their mothering instinct. Their babies are taken from them at a young age and bottle raised so that they can get the milks from the mothers instead. And so if you are buying your breeding goats from a setup like that, it is a bit hit and miss as to whether you're going to naturally get a mother goat with good instincts or not. It doesn't matter so much whether she herself was bottle raised. It's more what genetics she's carrying, whether they have good mothering instincts in their lines or not. The more interventions that the goats experience in that first couple of hours after the birth, the more likely they are of not recognizing their babies as their own. So it's a really fine line between watching and waiting and intervening as necessary. One of the big things we can upset by intervening is the smell of the baby goat. Mother goats rely on their sense of smell to be able to tell which goats are which and who they belong to. And you'll often notice that goats and sheep, and sometimes cows as well, will turn around and sniff their baby's bottoms while the baby is feeding, and that is how they recognize them as their own. So if you are wiping the baby down with a scented towel, just a towel from the washing machine will often smell like our washing powder. Or if you're cuddling a baby goat to try and warm it up, they're going to pick up your smell and your scent of your perfume or your deodorant or the smell of your clothes. And all of these can affect the smell of the baby. Another thing that can affect the smell of the baby is if you feed the baby something other than the mother goat's milk. So this could be if you gave it a molasses bolus, or if you used another mother goat's milk to just top them up with, or even some supplementary milk from a packet. All of those things will make the baby goat's bottom smell different to its siblings who have just had her own milk. Another reason that she might be rejecting her babies, especially if it's a few days down the track, is that maybe her udder is sore. So give a good look at her udder, check for any cuts or abrasions, and check her out and make sure that she doesn't have any signs of mastitis. If her udder is really tight and hot and full, it can be really helpful to help strip that out. It's great if you have a testing kit to check for mastitis as well. If there's any blood, or if it's thick and stringy, or just doesn't quite look right, it is worth getting it checked out by a vet. Goats can get really unwell really quickly from an untreated mastitis infection. Dairy goats will often produce a phenomenal amount of milk once their milk comes in, and even twins or triplets of little baby goats are not able to keep up with that supply straight away. So my best milkers, I actually milk them out after they've fed their babies a couple of times a day as well, just to keep on top of the amount of milk she's producing. Once the udders get really tight, the babies struggle to latch on, and that can be how mastitis can kind of spiral out of control. I can smell my lunch. The next thing is to check the baby's mouth. It's not completely unusual for the baby to have missing teeth or sharp teeth or crooked teeth or something wrong that means that they are actually hurting the mother while they're trying to latch on. So that's another good place to check as well. Now, goats are very instinctive animals, and they will usually reject a baby goat that has any deformities, shows signs of weakness, smells funny, or just isn't able to get up and get going straight away. And as humans, we find that really hard to deal with, but the goats, that is how their species has survived, and that's how come they are so hardy. So usually as humans, we will then pick that baby goat up and nurture it along. Personally, we have done that with a few goats, and sometimes they make it, and sometimes the mother was quite correct. There was something wrong and the baby just doesn't make it. So I'm not saying don't intervene, but what I'm saying is sometimes the mother will reject them for reasons that we can't see. And the final reason is that she has experienced undue stress. So stress around the birth and the time leading up to the birth and after the birth will cause her cortisol and her adrenaline levels to be so high that she's not able to experience the bonding hormone oxytocin. So not only can that disrupt the labor process itself, but it can definitely stop her from wanting to focus on her babies and wanting to raise them. When they are experiencing high levels of stress, they're going to be focused solely on their own survival. So what can you do if your mother goat has rejected her babies? One of the first things you need to be aware of is to intervene as little as possible. So there's a really fine line there between ignoring them and the baby dying unnecessarily and intervening too much that the mother will reject them. So If the baby is cold, for sure warm it up. If the baby is hungry and listless, it probably needs a top up of feed. But if it's none of those things, try and just let nature take its course and gently help and assist without getting too involved as much as possible. So once the baby is born, make sure that they are warm and dry. The mother will usually lick them really well and get them pretty dried off. If they're multiple births, sometimes, especially if the next one's coming quite quickly, she will sometimes leave the first one and sort of wander off a bit to have the second one. And sometimes they fail to come back to wipe down the first one again. So hopefully there's a bit of a space between them arriving and she'll get round to doing both or all three or all four. Some goats have a lot of babies. Ours usually have between 1 and 3. If you do have to use a towel or something to rub down the baby goats, grab some of the afterbirth, or also known as the placenta, and just dab it back on the baby goat to make it smell like mum again. If your baby goat is cold and lethargic and obviously hasn't had a decent feed, you need to warm the baby goat up before you try and give it any food. If you feed a cold baby goat, it does not end well. So before you give it any feed, make sure it's plenty warm enough. You can check the warmth of the baby goat by sticking your finger in its mouth, and their mouth should feel warm and wet, and usually they'll have a good suck reflex. If the suck reflex is gone and their mouth feels cold, that baby goat is about to die. You need to bring it inside and warm it up as quickly as possible. A nice warm bath is a really good way, and then blow drying it with a hairdryer just to warm it back up, and then you can give it some food. Ideally, the food you'll be giving it would be its mother's own colostrum. Colostrum is really important to get in those first 24 hours. It has a lot of antibodies and a lot of pro-digestive nutrients to help get their guts going, and it also has a lot of the bacteria to get their gut well colonized with the good probiotic bacteria that they need. So hopefully what you can do is go and milk some milk off the mother and feed it straight back to the baby. If you can't do that, you can use a supplementary formula or even some molasses mixed in some warm water. The idea is to not feed them any cold food and to try and keep them nice and warm. Once they've usually had that first good injection of food and sugar, they are usually a lot more robust and ready to go. If after an hour or two the mother goat is still not paying their babies any attention, this is usually a sign that they're going to need to be penned up together. So that's what we've done with River and her babies. These are her second lot of babies, but as I said, her first baby was really traumatic and she never raised him and never bonded with him. So she's quite unsure of these guys. I think they're both does. I must have a check. She's quite unsure of these two and not quite sure what she's meant to be doing. So the idea of penning them up is they can't wander off too far without their babies. Usually a goat will leave her babies somewhere safe and she'll go and get food and water. And this is what River did yesterday, but she was not listening to them when they cried. She wasn't coming back. She was completely ignoring them. So that's when we decided that we would pen her up with them. You need the pen to be big enough that mum can get up and walk around and do what she needs to do, but also small enough that babies with unsteady little legs can find her and feed from her. And a couple of times a day, probably every 3 hours or so, it's a really good idea to go down there, get mum to stand up, give her some grain or give her some hay, give her something to distract her, and latch the baby goats on, and that way you know that they are getting a decent amount of food. So we've been doing that with River. We've been going down every few hours and making her stand up. The bigger baby goat, she's feeding quite well. The little one still has the sort of turned back knees that sometimes the weaker babies have, which I have a video about, which I'll put up the top as well, how to encourage your baby goats to stand. So we're going down there and holding this baby goat up. There's a tiny little midge fly, holding this baby goat up so that she can stand properly and have a good feed, and we're latching her on. The first couple of times she was completely clueless, didn't know where she was going or what she was meant to be doing, but now she's a lot better. She's much quicker to latch on, and she is obviously getting some colostrum. Now she is also the same baby that Talia rubbed down and got nice and dry, and I'm so glad that she did, because I honestly believe that it was so cold last night that if she wasn't rubbed down nice and dry, she would have not made it through the night. Now while she's penned up, it's really important to make sure that your doe is getting really good nutrition. She's getting plenty of hay, plenty of fibre, and that she's getting either some alfalfa or some grain, some high protein food, and of course plenty of water to be making that milk for those babies. Now some mother goats are quite aggressive towards their babies, and I have heard of them bunting them and tossing them into water buckets and all sorts of horrible things. Now the key here is to keep those babies safe. Now whether you want to make a separate pen right next to the mum that the mother can't actually get into, but the babies are penned right next to her, and then bring them out and feed them, or whether you decide that it's just not safe enough and that you take those babies away and just bottle feed them for this time round. This will be a decision that you need to decide on depending on how rough she's being. A gentle butt away every time they try to feed is quite different to aggressively hunting them down and throwing them around. Usually the aim of the game to try and get this bonding to happen is to keep them in close quarters, keep the mum well fed so that she's not looking elsewhere to try and escape all the time, keep the stress really low, and to feed those babies as often as possible on the mother's milk. So every time she feeds the babies, to release the milk, she has a release of oxytocin to have that letdown effect. And that oxytocin is also that same hormone that causes the bonding. So if you can get them feeding, usually it can take up to 3 days. Occasionally it'll take a week of basically forcing the babies to latch on, holding mum still, and getting that milk let down oxytocin sort of cycle going. And of course, because they're drinking their own mother's milk, they're stimulating more production, and they're also going to be smelling like her because they're drinking her own milk as well. If after 3 to 5 days this really isn't working and the mother is still not at all interested in her babies, it is entirely up to you whether you want to leave them penned up and just keep feeding her and latching on the babies, or whether it's going to be easier for you to either milk her or make milk powder and feed the babies as bottle babies. There's no real wrong or right here. It very much depends what you're willing to do, how much time and effort and money you have to put into this situation, and which preference you have. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, hit the like button and consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you videos twice a week on growing and preserving your own food and other homesteading bits and pieces. And if you want to, check out the whole playlist I have on different bits and bobs about raising goats. We'll see you in the next one.
Right, go now.
This is a bow and arrow that me and Talia made.